Good to be with you all. You always know when you're in a Christian college, the front rows are empty. People ready to get out. I'm very grateful to, I still think of him as Senator Armstrong. He had a great run in Washington at one of the great times in our history and shared in the efforts to turn this country around in a most incredible way. And I'm also grateful in a personal fashion because both of my daughters, when they were in high school, worked as, or early college, worked for him as interns or pages, one a page, one an intern. And we were blessed to have him at our home several times for dinner with Ellen, and it was just a great time. One of my favorite sayings about Washington is that well, I call it, people ask me where I'm from, and I say the ethics capital of the world. That always brings a laugh. But one of my favorite sentences about Washington is, Washington's the city where no one takes friendship personally. I've got to cover a lot of ground today, and I hope you bear with me. But please feel free to interrupt with questions. And if there's if it's a thought I'm trying to complete before I turn to the question, bear with me if I say I'll be with you in just a minute on that. But don't hesitate to ask at any time, because I'll benefit by the exchange with you. I'll talk a little bit more to what your concerns are, then we just pass each other in the night. Now, is this loud enough back there? I put on the board, but I don't know if you can see it from this side of the room or not. I can see you're squinting already, but I didn't know how to get through the forest of flags here to do it otherwise. But it'll be just enough to. What my main purpose is to sketch indirectly. I'm not going to talk about it directly, but indirectly, the Jewish Christian metaphysic. Now, what I mean by metaphysics is the background view, the narrative you have for the whole sense of the universe, the cosmos, and, of course, of human life, too. So it's what you envision, the story you imagine in which you place things. And one of the distinctive things about Judaism and Christianity, they introduced into the world the idea of the future. The cultures of Asia and Africa were all involved in the cultures of eternal return. You just kept doing it again and again and again. And Judaism and Christianity pictured the world with a beginning and an ending point toward which we were called to move, and an ending point beyond where we started. So it had a moral imperative to it. We had to get better in these and those respects. That's a brand new, that shattered the world of Greece and Rome, the highest developed cultures of that time. And it's been doing it in Asia ever since. Asia is moving in a very rapid way to, by osmosis, to allow to enter this point of view, this vision, and the expectations, certain things you expect from history. Judaism and Christianity have taught us from the very first words of the Bible not to expect too much from human beings. They can be good and decent and thoughtful most of the time, but not always. Not always. Everybody sometimes sins. And don't be shattered when it happens. It's going to happen with very high frequency. And even if it's rare, it's going to happen at some time or another. Original sin, which was best explained to me once. What's a Roman Catholic doing talking at a Calvin college about original sin? And one of the professors put me straight right away. He said, look, the way we understand original sin is anyone who says man is totally depraved isn't all bad. And it just about gets it perfectly. Even if you have enough goodness in you to see what depravity is, that talks about the basic goodness of human nature as it sprung from the hand of the Creator, but is wounded. And we can't be surprised by those wounds. And that's a safeguard of Christian and Jewish civilizations against utopianism. You know, the literal meaning of utopia is nowhere. Topia's place, you is no place. And there's a perpetual tendency, especially among Christians, to leap to perfection too quickly and expect everything to be perfect. And peace on earth, goodwill to men is taken by some as a literal description, which it's not, and not ever is. It's an injunction, but not a description. So you need to expect, and I'm not giving you the whole dimensions of the metaphysics, but just a few things. And there are just certain presuppositions about the world that Judaism and Christianity have. Implicit in the whole story of the Torah and on into the New Testament, the bright red thread that runs through the very center of it and holds the book together, holds the binding together, is the idea of liberty. The whole suspense of every story in the Bible is how human beings will use their liberty. First of all, it singles out human beings as the reason God created the universe. Now, we may have to put that in context today, knowing what we do about how enormous the cosmos is and how many other galaxies there are. We don't know of any other with whom God has had the kind of relationship he has with us. There may be. Nothing in our faith says there can't be. But anyway, so far as we know, human beings are singled out. Now, this doesn't make common sense in one way. Remember one of my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, a think tank in Washington, raised his hand to object, and he said he thought cockroaches were going to inherit the earth long after there were human beings. Yeah, there were going to be cockroaches. Nobody had ever found a way to exterminate them. I think there's some plausibility in that. But the Torah is pointing to another line of thought. That the Creator wanted to make at least one creature, male and female, made in his image, who could reflect on their world and their experience and come to be grateful, be self-conscious enough to be grateful for the fact that they were created. I mean, the creature is not a creator. We have not created ourselves. Well, we know that. We don't choose our beginning, and we don't choose our ending. And we don't choose the talents and dispositions and health we have. It's given to us. And he also created us so as to invite us into his friendship. But he didn't want the friendship of slaves, but of free women and free men. And so he made us provident over our own life, provident over our own choices. Another way we're in the image of God. We have to choose whether we want to be God's friend or not. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness grasps it not. Or he offers his friendship, often again and again and again and insistently, and many, many people say no. And we all say no up to some point, some limit beyond which we don't give ourselves to God. Liberty is the red thread of history. From the point of view of the Bible, what really matters in the universe is located in the internal human spirit, in the human will. Whether it answers God's call, recognizes it and answers it, or does not. You know, most of the people who met and saw Jesus preach turned away. I mean, it's wrong to think that because Jesus was God, he just, boom. It didn't happen. As far as I can read the stories, huge majorities turned away from him. And that's the nature of the story. Even the chosen people, in large measure, turned away. Somebody asked Mahatma Gandhi what he thought of Christianity. He said, somebody should try it. You can't say we've done the kind of witness that we ought to have done down through history. It's easier to believe in God sometimes than it is to believe in the Christian people or the Christian church. But then it's human stuff God works with, you know. It's not angels, it's human stuff. And he seems to have patience with it. Well, what I'm trying to suggest is a whole way of looking at the world, which many people in our civilization just take for granted. They don't stop to think, where did they get that? Where did it come from? It came from Judaism and Christianity. It didn't come from Plato or Aristotle or the Stoics or Cicero or any of the great. It didn't come from Kant and Descartes, and it didn't come from modern philosophy. Compassion, for example. It was no great fault of a civilization to kill off their elderly and their infants. That happened often in the ancient world. And in fact, people felt it was only being strong and virtuous to get rid of them. No, the tribe couldn't carry them. And only Christianity, Judaism first, true religion, is to help the widow and the orphan, Deuteronomy. And, of course, the compassion taught to us by the whole New Testament. Bertrand Russell, the atheist philosopher of the 30s, he lived much longer than that, but that's when he was in full prominence. And then Richard Rorty, a less known but quite famous philosopher of our own time, just died a year or two ago. Both of them, in their own way, said the value most important to them was compassion. And they freely recognized they got it from Jesus Christ. But they prided themselves on their willingness to learn anywhere, from Goethe or Shakespeare. Or, there's a lot of wise people in the human race. You learn something from each of them. And that's the way they regarded Jesus. But the point is, they recognized that's where the idea entered the world. That you will judge a person in a civilization by how they care for the most vulnerable, for the most needy. Now again, that's not necessarily a common sense commandment or imperative, but it's what Jews and Christians expect. And by and large, it's come to be adopted in the politics of our own country. And we are always accusing each other of damaging people through mindless compassion, or being people too greedy and mean to be compassionate. The bar used by Republicans and Democrats for criticizing the other is compassion, and really effective compassion. I mean, it's one thing to say it, it's one thing to feel it, and it's another thing to improve the situation you're working with. The last is much, much harder than feeling compassion. Okay, so if I can just establish in the background of the whole way we live, and more the whole way the world lives, that's the main point I want to be working from, but I don't want to linger on that. I want to go on and do certain things. Now, it seemed to me for a long time that what we need to pay attention to, and here American Protestants, I think, are especially in need, is not only the individual, and the confessing of our Lord and Savior one by one. That's crucial. But at the same time, it's not only that. That Jesus called into being a people. And a people whose vocation was to go and teach all nations. This is where globalization first came into human history. Nobody had that view before. That I call the whole globe. The first form of globalization is religious. And the Christian church was the first multinational corporation. I mean, within a generation, it had spread all around the known world of the Mediterranean, and you can read early church fathers who marvel at that you can find bishops as far as Spain and as far as Damascus and north up into Constantinople and Antioch and Alexandria.
India.
Well, India took a little bit longer, but India too.
I believe Thomas made it there.
Well, okay. Okay. Let's assume he did. Certainly the intention was that he ought to have. And it did this peacefully, by the way. It's one of the most extraordinary stories in history. That Christianity should have captured the soul, the mind and souls of that whole part of the world in diversity, different languages, different ways of doing it, different languages. The Coptic church in Egypt, and I can't remember the name of the group in Baghdad, among the oldest Christian communities, older than the Roman community, and Antioch. And they still say Mass, the Eucharist, in their own languages. And according to a ceremony that's rather different, called a rite, that's rather different. But there's a community, and more impressive to me than community, more complex, more difficult to get your hands on, is the importance of institutions. You know, it's good to have breakfast in the morning. It's even better to have an institutional setup whereby somebody is milking the cows and somebody is getting the milk to the cities and somebody's invented the refrigerator and it's available in the local store and you always have it in your refrigerator, and you know, even if you're half asleep you can open the refrigerator and pull it out. The institution is a special kind of good, and not very many places have institutions that work well. It used to take you half an hour on the Italian phone system to get through. I mean, the numbers were incredibly badly wired, and you'd end up who knows where. No wonder everybody turned to cell phones and broke through that. You can go to an airport, arrive in an airport and look in vain for a taxi. No one's commanded that they be there, and there just aren't any, and so forth. Lots of places the world doesn't work very well. So institutions are extremely important. But let me cut close to the chase here. I'm just going to plunge right in and say, in thinking about the world, there are three liberties that human beings have learned over the ages really to cherish, because not having them is so awful. One of them is freedom from poverty. It's on the board over there. Freedom from poverty. And poverty in the Bible was taken as part of the human condition. The poor you shall always have with you. Show compassion for the poor, help the poor, but they're always going to be there. It wasn't until 1776, 1,700 years after the Bible, or at least after the preaching from which the Bible was then taken, the New Testament was then taken and written down in another generation or two, that the idea occurred in human history that the wrong question is to ask, what are the causes of poverty? I mean, think about it for a minute. I see articles on this all the time, cover story of Newsweek, the causes of poverty, causes of world poverty, or something like that. It's absolutely the wrong question. As you can see instantly, if you ask yourself, what would it be like to find the answer? Suppose you figure out how to cause poverty. I mean, wonderful, You just haven't moved anywhere. Who wants to produce more poverty? Poverty is what you have when you don't know causes. Poverty is the default position of the human race. It's what most of the human race, well, you can't say it is now, but a good chunk of the human race is now poor, about a third. And in past generations, more than that. And the earlier back you go, the more universal poverty was. Disease, ignorance. Poverty is just a name for a large array of difficulties. But once you figure out the causes of wealth, and the causes of wealth of all nations, not just of individuals. I mean, the viewpoint of Adam Smith was that of a Christian minister. He was a minister. And that of compassion for the whole world, if you wish. How do you remove the awful poverty of the whole world, of all the poor people of the world? How do you break the chains of poverty universally? Again, it's the first vision of economics, the knowledge of how to create wealth. And at the same time, it's the first vision of doing this on a global scale. And with that, he created a new moral imperative. If you can create wealth and remove poverty, then you must. Before that, the attitude of all Christendom was, there are lots of poor people. Fine. God loves poor people. He doesn't look to our wealth or our poverty to make judgment of us, but at what's in our hearts and what's in our deeds. And that's true. But Adam Smith added a new moral imperative onto that. Once you know how to create wealth, it's wrong not to. And that's why there's nobody could go to the United Nations today from any part of the world, Burma or Togo or wherever, and say, my people are a poor people, and we intend to keep them that way. I mean, and it doesn't quite work to say my people are poor people, and we need everybody else to come move us out of poverty. That doesn't wash any longer either. Nowadays, the more and more, it's coming more and more, when people talk about poverty, they begin to feel ashamed of their country. We've had so many poor nations move out of poverty in the last 50 years, about 2/3 of the human race, that it's harder and harder to find excuses. Countries which had much less, look at Japan. It's hardly some rocks bursting up from the water. It's I don't think the full size of California. And you can only farm at about 20% of it, as I understand it. And the population lives on 20% of the coastal plain, not many in the mountains. And it's overpopulated. It's got way too many people for that little island. No natural resources of energy. You say, if any place in the world ought to be poor, it's Japan, right? In terms of resources, in terms of land, in terms of overpopulation. But son of a gun. They produce about 10% or 11% of everything produced in the world. They're one of the wealthiest nations in the world. We'll come back to that. So it's hard for poor nations like Brazil, which is 40 times larger than, I'm making up 40 times, don't take me literally, larger than Japan. Brazil is larger than the whole United States, except for Alaska, from which you can see Russia. I've never thought that so funny, because the actual truth is when it freezes over, they think that's how those we now call the American Indians reached this continent, is they walked, or I hope rode in sleighs of some primitive kind. It's not very far, but that's another line of thought. But what I wanted to say is it puts a lot of pressure on Brazil to explain why they have so many poor people. You know, it doesn't help the morale of the leadership of Brazil to recognize their position in the world. They have probably more resources than any other piece of territory in the world, maybe more than North America, almost surely. and maybe as many as Russia and Siberia. But there's not 1% of the world's product produced by them. So you see, you understand there's a new morality, a new imperative, the imperative of development. You must help your people to develop economically, if you possibly can. That's a new change in our new idea of system. You need to have a way of moving people out of poverty. Now, I want to say on this, while I'm at it, just one more thought. The United States is often accused of still having poor people, between 11 and 14%. But one thing is not pointed out is we take in about 10 million immigrants legally every decade, and maybe at least half as many, maybe twice as many illegally. So there's a constant influx of 10 to 15 million people into our system, almost all of whom come here poor. So we're not on a treadmill where we keep spinning our wheels and we're not making any progress. The reverse is true. Most of these people move up in 5 to 10 years. I mean, look around Denver, look around anywhere. Immigrants who come here move through from poverty to owning a little bodega or their own little company for laying tiles, or whatever they do, and they work hard. And they do the old American story again and again and again. And you start to see more and more of them in the universities, and more of them becoming doctors and lawyers. But no sooner do they advance than a whole new cadre takes their place, and the figures on poverty stay about the same. We don't get credit for that. But nobody ever said life is fair. In fact, I tell my children, I told them when they were young, one of them complains, "You gave her more than me." Get used to it, kid. That's the way life is, and then freedom from tyranny. Well, I'm not going to linger so long on that because it's a little bit more obvious. Tyranny and torture. How do you form a government which does not fall back on tyranny and torture? And why do so many governments fall back on tyranny and torture? Well, you learn that it has a special connection to one-man rule. Sooner or later, for the good of a people, an unchecked dictator is going to impose punishments on people according to his own best judgment. And after a time, people recognize you have to have checks and balances on that. You can't allow unchecked power, or it's going to be abused. And pretty soon you learn that dictators are very prone to going to war, because when things get restless at home, they need to distract their people by uniting them around an enemy. And the human race has learned some lessons over time, and so begun experimenting with new forms of political institutions that produce over generations freedom from torture and freedom from tyranny. Now, that's always fragile. It's not, once you get it, it's not there forever. All it takes is for one generation to forget how you do this and you just turn out the lights, or a generation that says, "Oh, this is easy, we don't need to work at this," and lose it. Turn out the lights, hand in the keys, turn out the lights, and close the doors. Democracies, as we call them, I think a better word really is republics, meaning a limited government under the rule of law. Democracies have a tendency not to have limited government under the rule of law because the majority gets too powerful and just takes what it wants. We have in America right now about 40% of the people who vote, their living is paid by the state. I mean, how are they going to vote if they value their own interests? And how many more can you go before you've given away the country? So a majority can easily be a tyrant. In fact, that's one of the things our founders feared most, is the tyranny of a majority. So how do you get a republic under the rule of law and small government and maintain it over generations? It's a very difficult task. Abraham Lincoln said there's a further danger. He called it the silent artillery of time. And he pointed out that the generation that fought the War of Independence, well, only about a third of them actually fought or supported it. 2/3 of the people were against it or didn't support it. I mean, you mustn't think that American majorities all together do the right thing. Usually the people who do the right thing tend to be in more of a minority than it looks like when you study it later on it looks like it was easy. At the time it wasn't. But those folks were really heroic. John Adams was offered the job of something, I don't remember the exact title of it, but Lord General Counselor of the King of His Majesty in Massachusetts and looking toward expanding elsewhere. I mean, the highest legal office in the country. And by fighting so hard for independence, he not only lost that, but he put his neck in the noose. Somebody only had to grab hold and pull it. And that meant disgrace for his children forevermore. You're the grandchildren of traitors. So the stakes were pretty high. Well, Lincoln says that generation was heroic, and their children, the next generation, tried to emulate them and live up to them. Not as successfully. And the grandchildren were tired of hearing about it and just wanted to live in a different way. And so you have to measure the ethics of a country over generations. It's not just in one generation. There's a natural cycle of decline. And here Judaism and Christianity introduced into history another idea, the awakening, the Great Awakening. It's possible because of the relationship of the Christian God to our inner souls that enough people can be touched and converted and live in a different way and establish new institutions that they can awaken the country and get a fresh start. There's no other ethical system that does that. If you live in a system that's relativistic and nihilistic, thinks there's no difference. A law school teacher at a Christian college that I know of was trying to teach his students that this is unjust and that's unjust and you can't do this. And often he got resistance from students who would say, well, that's just your opinion. We think this. Or he might say abortion is unjust. That's just your opinion. We think it's perfectly right. Or all the issues you want to name. So as he handed out his papers for the last examination, he said to them, you know how competitive law school students are and how much they depend on their class ranking and everything. He says, don't worry about this. He said, I'm going to mark you, you're all going to pass. I'm going to mark you pass, fail, and it'll be hard to fail. They went hit the ceiling. This would ruin their legal scores, their law school scores. That's not just, they said. He said, that's just your opinion. It was his last lesson to the class. Well, Christianity and Judaism introduced the idea that every so many generations there could be a change of heart among so many people that a whole country would begin to move in another direction. And we've had 3 of them in American history. Before the War of Independence, beginning in the 1830s or so, partly with the temperance movement, but then it grew into the, and by the way, the temperance movement, it was not something silly. The consumption of alcohol in the United States, especially on the frontier, just went way up. I mean, people were consuming more alcoholic beverages than, well, like the temperance worker showed a man. She said, you see these 2 glasses, this one's whiskey and this one's water. Now watch what happened. And she dropped the same identical worm in both of them. And worm, and the whiskey just shriveled up and hit the bottom real quick. And the worm in the water just swam around a little bit. Now she said, now, what do you learn from that? And he said, ain't never going to have worms. Well, anyway, the temperance movement showed that there could be quite radical transformations in whole families and whole towns and whole parts of towns and more territories. And then the abolition movement moved right in behind it. And more people began to think, you cannot wish that somebody would sell you into slavery yourself. And if you cannot wish it on yourself, you can't wish it on anybody else. This is Abraham Lincoln's argument. Let me point out, this is the 150th anniversary of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And remember what those were about? Choice. Douglas agreed that slavery was wrong, but he thought every state has a right to make the choice whether they want to be a slave state or a free state. Don't like slavery? Don't have it. Not good enough for Lincoln. It's immoral. It's against a fundamental human right for a person to use his power to enslave another when he cannot wish anybody else to enslave him. Or cannot wish to be in a war in which everybody's enslaving everybody else. There's some things you cannot choose. And I think the parallels to the argument on abortion are very much the same. It's an abuse of power for one person to take another human individual's life when you could not wish somebody took your life. It's the 150th anniversary of that, and of course everybody misses the point. They forget that the argument was about choice. So that's what I mean by the background metaphysics that we carry with us. And one last one I need to mention. There's nothing plainer in the Torah and in the Christian Testament. The Christian Testament adopted the Torah. There's an asymmetry between Jews and Christians. Christians must be Jews. We must accept the truth of Judaism or we miss the whole point. I mean, Christianity loses its whole point. If it's not the fulfillment of Judaism, we have to start the argument all over again. But Jews do not have to be Christians, if you follow what I mean. I mean, a good Jew, to be a good Jew, thinks or has to think or in fact thinks that Christianity is a terrible heresy, a blasphemy. They think someone is God who isn't God. So Jews don't have to be Christians in the way that a Christian must be a Jew. So there's an asymmetry. But we share so very much in common, and most of what we know about institutions and about politics and society comes from the Jewish Testament, not the Christian. The great Christian principle is give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, Matthew 22. That's the great anti-totalitarian principle. It's the great roadblock to unlimited government. Not everything belongs to Caesar. Caesar is not omnipotent. God is God. Caesar isn't God. So there's a whole realm of life which is not in the control of Caesar. And the trick is to get Caesar to recognize that and respect it. It's like animal rights. You know, the difficulty with animal rights is getting the animals to respect them. You know, now, this idea that there's a creator means that there's a transcendent power greater than the creation. The creation doesn't explain itself. Whatever God is, and we don't see God, whatever God is, he's more than the sum of the things we do see. And you can say in some ways he's within them, because without his presence in them, we would all dissolve into nothingness. It's the power of existing which God exercises. Who is God? He is who is. I mean, the fundamental characteristic of God is existing. Existing comes from a Latin word ex, meaning out of, like exit. And sistere, to stand there. To stand out of nothingness. First there was the chaos and the nothingness. And then God created light, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this act of existing, it's from this act of existing that the fires break out everywhere else, the little things existing, each of us temporarily. At a time we didn't choose, the light came into us. At a time we don't choose, the light is snuffed out. But for that time, we exist by the inner presence of God in us. So you can talk about God being in the world, but you can't talk about God being in the world in such a way that the world shuts off the whole meaning of God. He transcends it. And the way the Bible chose to talk about this is that God is spirit and truth. Now again, this is revolutionary. If you've been to Mexico, and you really ought to go and visit those magnificent Mayan cities and temples and see what they thought about God. Rain, for one thing, where life depended on rain. And when it was absent for almost a generation, they just perished. And the soil was too thin. I don't understand the whole thing, but... Or the jaguar in the dark. You can understand the sense of that power, beyond human power. I mean, I don't blame people for thinking about God in these ways. What are the forces that are greater than we are? That inspired us awe and fear. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, the Bible says. But Judaism says, no, that's not true. God is not a power of that sort. The rain, the jaguar, the stone god, or the golden god. Golden Colorado, okay. But God is spirit and truth. Now that leads Jews and Christians to recognize that God, our God, is not impressed by our wealth or our power or our longevity or our deeds or our goodness or anything else. He sees right through us. He knows what we come from. He sees to our inner life. He sees to our thoughts and our aspirations, even before we become conscious of them. And therefore, conscience matters. What's really important to him is not the way you burn oil before the shrine or kneel or bow. What's really important to him is whether there's a change in heart. Now this is absolutely crucial, and practically everybody misses it. If you read Jefferson's argument for the Bill of Religious Liberty in the state of Virginia, which is written in about 1783 or 4, I think. I can't remember the exact date. What he says is that the Almighty God, who could have made us unfree, instead gave us freedom. It was in his power to make us unfree and just make us do what he makes cats and dogs do, follow their instincts, given us instincts, and we had no choice but to follow our instincts. He didn't do that. He gave us another set of instincts which are to pass judgment on our first set of instincts and say, yeah, that's what I want to do, but that's what I can't do. I ought to do something different. It's a second set of instincts that are there. And those are the more godlike instincts because of the power to reflect, weigh the evidence, make a judgment, and choose. Commit yourself. And it's because God made it this way. That's one principle. And then put beside it the principle that religion, this is the way it was understood for 40 or 50 years at the time of the Revolution. Religion is the honor and praise that the creature owes to the Creator. That's the way it's defined in Webster's Dictionary, 1828. And that's exactly what Jefferson says in his bill. Religion, or the obligation that men owe to honor and thank their Creator. And for him, this is self-evident. If you know what a creature is and what a creator is, you see which one owes thanks, which one ought to bow. But since we're the kind, put these two together, since we are the kind of creatures that are obliged to kneel only to the evidence of our own minds, you must allow religious freedom of conscience in a republic, because a person's own conscience is in direct connection to God. And neither the state nor even the family has a right to interfere in that. The individual is obliged to choose. And each must be free to choose if you follow out what God has made them. Now, no other religion can make that argument for religious liberty. I mean, it's stunning. Jefferson doesn't even realize it's a Jewish or Christian argument. He uses Jewish or Christian words, but he's sometimes right as if this is an achievement of the Enlightenment and of deism. It's just not true. The God of deism is indifferent. He doesn't have any mind or will or concern about inner life. Just totally impersonal. Jefferson is here borrowing Jewish and Christian conceptions of God. You can't do this with Hinduism. You can't do it with Islam, because Islam does not pay attention to the evidence of our own minds, but to the submission of our will. It's a totally different conception of God, Islam. It's a God of Abraham in a sense, but in another sense it's not. It goes up a different way. That God can be perfectly arbitrary. He can make 2 and 2 equal 5 if he chooses to, because he's omnipotent. And Jews and Christians don't think that way about God. God is the source of intelligence and order and law. We talk about the law of God, the governor of the universe. And God, in his nature, respects the law of his own being. And it's the sharing of that being and the law-likeness inherent in it that he gives to human beings. And that's why we have such regard for the evidence of our own minds, one by one. I'm sorry, I'm going out of my way a little bit, but I just think that's a crucial point in understanding American founding. That it's a founding that depends entirely on a Jewish-Christian metaphysics. It is not a deist rationalist metaphysics, the way most historians present it. It can only be understood in terms of presuppositions, expectations, and visions of Judaism and Christianity. And this is one clear instance of it. We get our argument for religious liberty from the nature of the Christian God and his relationship to every person and that person's mind. Okay, so much by way of background. What I mean by democratic capitalism, then, is the system. It is 3 systems are involved. What makes it so? The reason I came to doing this book was that traveling in Europe, friends, journalists, professors used to ask me, can you recommend a good book to us about how the American system works? And I couldn't. I could name some political books that talked about politics. And I could name some fine economists, Milton Friedman and others, who talked about economics. And I could name some who wrote very well about the civic republicanism that formed the ethos of the founding period, and the early intermixture of Christianity and civic republicanism that Tocqueville comments on. You know, he said Americans can't talk about liberty without talking about religion, or about religion without talking about liberty. In America, they're one. In Europe, they're not. Europeans see a contradiction between the two. Not in America. And so there's a special American ethos. And there are good books about that. But nobody's put those together. Some people are partisans of the political system, some people are partisans of the economic system, some people are partisans of the way human beings think and judge. And I thought, no, it's the package that's the original. The founders chose as a motto of the United States. They worked on the seal of the United States. They had 7 different versions of it. You can find it on the dollar bill if you have it. It's worth taking a look. It's usually passed through your hand so fast you don't get a chance to look. But over here on the green side of the dollar bill is the pyramid, and you see the motto down below, Novus Ordo Seclorum. Anybody know what that means?
New order of the ages.
That's good. Were you Catholic once? Catholics, having learned Latin, used to know that. They don't anymore. But yeah, the new order of the ages. The motto put there first, for the first 6 drafts, was virtue. Meaning, unless you have people of certain habits, you're just not going to have liberty. Because liberty means having the habits of temperance and judging things justly, and courage and tenacity. It means a whole set of habits which allow you to practice self-government. They use the word virtue for that. But it seems so self-evident, didn't it, that you couldn't be free without virtue? How could you have self-government without self-government? And so in the end, they put Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages. Now, what a tremendous boast that is for a new republic of 4 million people strung out along the East Coast. People along the East Coast are still strung out. My assistant is, executive assistant is here with me. I mean, not in the room, but he lives just 4 or 5 miles away here in Lakewood. And he said he just enjoys coming back to Denver because nobody's in quite the same rush. When you're going up the escalator or down the escalator at the airport, there's not somebody pushing you over from the left all the time. This happens in Washington normally and regularly. And anyway, that's why we're strung out along the East Coast. I'm not going to describe the whole thing, but I used to teach a seminar on what's this ordo, what's new about it, and why do we say of the ages in it? That's a different lecture to talk about. But just summarize it in a sentence. The ordo, they give a picture of it right there. It's a 3-sided system. And that's new. There hasn't been such a system ever. I like to think across the bottom is written in Roman numerals, showing that it's a Catholic document. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. 1776. What's significant in 1776? The Declaration of Independence and the publication of Adam Smith, Nature of the Causes and the Wealth of Nations, which Jefferson described as, we're all children of this book. We're all Whigs. That was the name they called themselves, Whigs, and children of this book. And what that meant is they understood that you need to have a commitment to political liberty at one corner of the pyramid, and at economic liberty at the other corner of the pyramid. And then third, the top, you notice there isn't a top. Moral and cultural dimension of spirit, conscience, ideas, information. You can't put a cap on that. That's open to the transcendent. And you have the transcendent eye there to do it. And in that sense, the building is always incomplete. Jefferson pointed this out. You will never be at a point where you have enough justice, enough liberty to say the experiment is complete. You're always going to have to be moving. And that's partly where America gets its dynamism and a sense of renewal, possibility of renewal. I once used this, I happened to be sitting at a Washington dinner, those wonderful kind you sometimes have with the finance minister of the first Chinese governmental delegation to come to Washington. A very handsome woman, I must say, and rather young. And she asked me a couple questions about America, and I got this out and, explained it to her. It's a very simple way to explain it. You need these three separate systems, political, economic, and then she took note, and then I asked her, I said, now, let me ask you a question. How do you deal with Marx now that you're practicing capitalist? You've opened up the capitalist order, encouraged enterprise, encouraged private property for the first time in generations. And she pushed back her chair from the table and gave me that cold look and said, sir, Karl Marx is very old and very dead. We don't deal with him. I thought that was kind of cute, kind of neat. They're moving in a very different way. But they're moving partly in our way, I'm trying to say, by embracing one more corner. Now, they're making a bet that they can have economic liberty without moving to a Republican form of government and without freedom of conscience and inquiry and so forth. They're thinking they can keep a communist cap. I think it's a bet they're making. I think they're going to lose it. Because when enough people in business, and it's happening already, become very wealthy and very successful, they just know how to do things. I think already Chinese is providing more cement than anybody else in the world. They're building more merchant ships than anybody else in the world, et cetera. Well, who's doing this? There's some geniuses in organization and in dealing with people and in dealing in finance. You have to have a whole set of talents to be a CEO of something like this. And it doesn't take long for them to start realizing we have a lot more brains than those commissars. They don't know what they're talking about. And they're making the rules and they don't know. And that's where the demand starts for Republican government. We all have to have a voice in this. You're going to destroy the whole thing. It's happened in Chile. It happened in Spain. It happened in Portugal. It happened in Greece. I think it's a law of freedom. But, we'll see. It's an empirical law, so it could be wrong. Okay. Now, if you wish, what I'd like to do is spend just a little bit of time, then I'd like more questions from you. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the least well-understood part of our system, namely the capitalist order. If any of you have been educated in the humanities or in theology, I'm willing to bet you were educated as I was, to think that there's something faintly smelly about capitalism. It's about greed, it's about selfishness, it's about hard-heartedness. Exactly what Democrats say about Republicans, for instance. And when they say Republicans are the party of business, that's what they mean by it. So a wide swath of the population, and most of the professors seem to mean that. And most of the school teachers seem to mean that. And to be truthful, most of the pastors seem to mean that. It's rare to find a pro-capitalist pastor. I remember at Harvard Divinity School reading Paul Tillich, who said any serious Christian must be a socialist. And the reason was capitalism's all about self-aggrandizement, it's greed. Quite the opposite is true. You have to remember that the Bible gave us very little information about a proper economic order. In the biblical period, they had not reached the insight that wealth can be created. They were still living in a world in which wealth was typically seized. If you were a baron or had a castle anywhere in the world, and your wife wanted new silverware and some new jewels and some new velvet or whatever to make dresses or whatever, there wasn't any place to buy these. I mean, you couldn't go down to Macy's. If you wanted them, you had to go and take them. Yeah.
Still, the New Testament is very clear about private property rights. Think of the parable Jesus told of the workers in the morning, the workers in the afternoon. Didn't the landowner say, it's my money, don't I have the right to do with my own money what I want to do with it? And also in the parable of the talents, if there's any income redistribution, that is not from the poor, from the rich to the poor, but from the irresponsible to the responsible, because an irresponsible steward who was cast into outer darkness, what the little that he had was taken from him and given to those who were more responsible.
Well, I think that's good as far as it goes, and I wish you good luck in teaching that to high school teachers and college teachers and the rest, and pastors. I don't think it goes far enough, and I'll explain why not in just a minute, but those are good steps. Another one I would add on your side of the ledger is, the commandment says, thou shalt not steal. That implies private property. I mean, if people don't have private property, there's no way you can steal. So I think that's a great endorsement of private property. But let me rush on just for a minute. I think of capitalism this way, and I think the idea is lying around there, but I think I'm the first one to use it systematically like this. I prefer to use the term capitalism for the system because it comes from the fundamental dynamic of the system. It comes from the Latin word caput, the head, the old head. Now, of course, they often meant heads of cattle. You measured your wealth by 200 head or 400 head or whatever. And that's a great Western description, too. How many head of cattle you own was a measure of your wealth. But it has that other meaning of the human head. The fundamental energy of capitalism is the energy of discovery and invention. That's what most of the wealth of the modern world comes from. Wealth used to be land. The bushels of apples you could grow, the wheat, the horses, the steers. Wealth was land. Abraham Lincoln writes, and this he gives beautifully in the Wisconsin State Fair address of 1858, before he's president. The fellow who invents a new seed, breeds a new seed, from which you get 4 grains of wheat rather than 1, is a great benefactor of the human race. Now, that's an idea that he can find in John Locke. I don't think he read John Locke, but you would find it there. And therefore, that's why Lincoln very much favored, when it came time for him to support the Homestead Act and the Land Grant Act, any new territory that wished to become a state and join the Republic had to set aside land for land grant colleges, because he believed that's the cause of wealth. The old caput. You want to train people, they learned how to get 4 grains, 4 stalks from 1 seed instead of 1. And ways of improving the quality of the milk and the quantity of milk given by cows. My wife's family is from Iowa, and they had a dairy farm, and the guy from the county agricultural department used to come around and take samples of the milk and tell them what they should improve. Give them more of this or less of that, well, you get the point. Scientific agriculture, in short. In 1968, my children, who were then quite young, not older than 5 years, got to ride in the Centennial Day Parade of Cresco, Iowa. Now, leading the parade was a covered wagon, a Conestoga wagon, just like the one that came there in 1868, the first one. And people one of my kids was dressed in as one of the children on the covered wagon. And then there came the various carriages that came along. And at the end of the line, there was a huge threshing machine. It was taller than any of the 2-story buildings on Main Street. It couldn't open up its wings because it was able to deal with 30 rows at a time. It was air conditioned and had stereo sound. Now that's what you mean by development. I go back to the poverty of those first settlers. a plow had never cut the soil of that land when they arrived there. And in some places they had to cut through 12 inches of tangled grass roots, get rid of it, to get to the good black soil underneath. That's how economic progress came, by invention. Things like this thresher, like the stereo, like the air conditioning, they didn't exist in 1868. Somebody had to think about them. Now, here's why Lincoln said, in describing the 6 great steps in the history of liberty. It's a brilliant talk. Well, actually, it's a talk he first gave as a young man in 1831 in Illinois. I'm not going to go through them all, but the great step, in some ways the greatest step, he argued, was the U.S. patent and copyright law. It's the only place in the whole U.S. Constitution in which the word right is mentioned, in the body of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, I think I'm right to say. I sometimes get confused between 8 and 9, but one or the other. This document is giving to Congress the powers from the people. The people grant to the Congress the following powers and no others. So if you're ever in the position of doing that, you want to keep it short. You don't want to give the government too much power, because every one you give them is going to be abused. I mean, that's human nature, original sin. But one of the powers conveyed to the was to give to inventors and authors the right for a limited time to the fruit of their inventions. Give them patents and copyrights. This transformed the history of the world, according to Lincoln, but according to me and according to common sense. Because it took the main value in human economic history out of the land and put it up here. Lincoln himself was proud of having taken out 2 patents in his lifetime. That anybody could do it. My wife's grandfather and uncle, between them, had 18 patents. From their little county of that part of Iowa, northeastern Iowa, there were hundreds of patents issued over a 40 or 50-year period from about 1880 to 1920. Everybody in America was inventing things. It's the greatest explosion of invention in the history of the human race. And from it came the wealth. We have some great inventions like chewing gum, for instance, hula hoops, and useful things, like airplanes. All my favorite environmentalists fly lots of airplanes to get to their meetings. You know, it's just one of those things. All my formerly socialist friends drive Volvos. I mean, you know, they don't believe in multinational corporations, but they buy overseas from corporations. Again, that's the way life is. So this move from land to mind is the great step that indicates the origins of capitalism. Why we only speak of capitalism in the modern world. In Jerusalem in the Bible, we can speak of private property. We can speak of markets, because Jerusalem in the Bible, that's all it was a marketplace between 3 continents. Roads from Asia, Africa, and Europe converged there. And they bought and sold. And that's what made Jerusalem famous and rich. There were no factories. They weren't producing anything. And there wasn't a lot of agriculture or cattle, because it was arid. It was mostly desert around. Not desert, but arid around it. And famine was a real danger. One long season of no rain, and people starved. Because a lot of the foods there was no way to keep. You could grow all the apples you wanted, let's say. This is not for Jerusalem, but you know, if you didn't have a place to keep them, best you had was a couple of months, then they were bad. That was a mess to throw them out. There weren't roads, there weren't merchants, there weren't, anyway. So capitalism comes into the world when things like the patent, when you get an institution like the law of patents and copyrights, and when you empower the human mind to own ideas. Then you give the greatest wealth not to the landed aristocracy, who might be pretty dumb. All they had to do was inherit it, and they didn't have to sharpen their wits too much. And you turn it over to young and hungry young men and women who think, and think practically about things. and become fabulously wealthy. My favorite story is Ray Kroc of McDonald's. He was the first one to get the image of the fact that the mothers of America were going to work. And they weren't going to want to cook a meal in addition every night. And so at least one night a week, they would want a place where they could take their children that was clean, efficient, quick, because you can't put up with the screaming kids in public all that long, and good food, nourishing basic food. And he also invented for it, I think, the greatest commercial symbol of them all. Come to mama, he said. And most people think it's an M, but I don't think it's an M. I told that to him once, and he just gave me the kind of look and said, "Of course, you idiot. What do you think?" I thought I was being too literary in doing this. But anyway. And, you know, in doing that, he gave many, his favorite place, my grandchildren and children used to delight if we went to McDonald's. They loved it. And gave Mama a break. It was cheap. And he put more young people to work and paid them for the privilege than all the federal programs for youth unemployment did. And he paid taxes for the privilege. Not only didn't it cost the government anything, the government made money from it. So he created millions of jobs and hundreds of thousands of owners, because as you know, the McDonald's are usually owned by franchisees. So he put a lot of people in business. I love those humble little things. After all, Jesus himself ran a small carpenter business. It's a very humble business, but one of the things Christianity and Judaism teaches us is look to the humble things for the great value. It's for the humble and forgotten things that the greatest value comes. And I think that's true of small business everywhere. So the heart of capitalism is invention and discovery. It's the old kaput. The rugs on this floor didn't exist. This kind of tabletop didn't exist. These things didn't exist. These kind of chairs didn't exist. This may be real wood, but some of them aren't. The kind of chair I'm sitting in is all synthetic. Very good, but it wasn't given to us by nature. It was given to us by human mind. I know the man who invented you think this is silly, the glue that holds plywood together. You know, it's just, he figured out layers of wood laid cross grain would be very strong. Only problem was, how could you glue them together? Only problem with that was all the known glues stank. They were made out of horses or something or other. And his genius was inventing an odorless glue. I mean, it sounds silly, but you can imagine how wealthy he was. If every piece of plywood had a little bit of his glue in it. But he served the common good. He did more for the common good. He created jobs, and all in a system of freedom. Nobody had to buy the plywood. And there are all kinds of businesses that have not served the public well, and people just stopped going to them. What's that car that Ford company made they were so proud of and they named for? The Edsel. It had the hugest advertising campaign in history. People aren't gullible. You know, if they don't like the product, it just dies. And movie makers have a very hard time. They invest millions in a movie and it's a complete bust. And then there are other movies that are small budget and all that people take to. Well, that's more chance because you're playing on taste. And I think that's one reason Hollywood is so anti-business. Because you don't succeed in terms of merit. You succeed in part by the way the fickle public taste goes. You may have the best military or the best romantic story of the year, but if the public just had 8 big hits, and yours is the 9th, I mean, it just doesn't go that well. Anyway, so they think it's all fickle and accidental and not really earned. The dictionaries define capitalism. They all do. I had my assistant check 7 or 8 of them, and I've written them down somewhere in something I wrote, but I'm not going to repeat them all. But capitalism is a system which abolishes markets in favor, capitalism is a system which has markets. It has private property, and it has private profit. Well, that's not good enough. As Professor was helping me to say a few minutes ago, the Bible shows that all these things existed in the Bible. But that didn't make capitalism. You know, Max Weber's famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, tries to say that capitalism didn't come into existence until after Protestantism. There were certain ideas Protestantism had to enter. As a Catholic, I sort of resent the notion that only Protestants have a work ethic. But I think Max Weber was onto something. It is a Christian ethic and a Jewish ethic. Jews and Christians have always believed that work is good. To work by the sweat of your brow is good. It's good for your soul. It's good for the people. And not true in Islam. Work is something that's very good for others to do. So I do think there's a Jewish-Christian work ethic. And I think it was brought to a certain focus by a variety of factors in the Protestant countries. Although preceding them, the first manifestations of capitalism are in the south of France and in Italy, which are completely overlooked by Max Weber. But the economic historians have demonstrated that conclusively now. That's where the small business still prevails in Italy. In the top 10 regions of the European community, in all the regions of all the members of the European community, the top 10 districts for business formation, 4 of them are in Italy. And they've been doing it for thousands of years, small businesses. And they do it with, what they do is they make articles with great taste. Same articles everybody else makes, but they make scarves that are inimitable. And they even manufacture antiques that nobody else can match. I mean, you see factories making antiques that are just priceless as far as I'm concerned. But nobody else has the craftsmanship to pull it off. Whatever they make more beautifully than anybody else. Shoes, blouses. Well, you get the point. Okay, I've said enough to describe a little bit about capitalism. It only works if it satisfies the common good, if it keeps improving the common good. You measure its success by how many poor it lifts out of poverty every 10 years. Does the standard of living of the poor go up every 10 years? That's the fundamental measure in my view. The fundamental measure is not equality, which so many in the church say it is. A good society is not the equal society. In fact, that's the most tyrannical, unimaginably inhuman society. James Madison described equality as a wicked project because you can only get there by chopping down the talents of those who have superior talents. Why would you do that? Why would you injure the country by taking away its best talents? But the goal of it is to keep improving the condition of the poor, not hacking down the people at the top. I think a great measure of how you measure political parties is one party typically wants to punish the people who are rich and think that's going to help the poor. It's a terrible mistake. Ronald Reagan took the opposite position. If you lower the tax rates of the rich, which he did from 70% to, was it 35% or something like, say, 28%? He didn't get less money from the rich. He got more revenue from the rich than anybody ever had. And they liked it because they were bringing in more money too. And with the new capital they had, they invented a whole slew of new industries, which didn't even exist when Reagan became president. Computers, personal computers, smaller and smaller computers, cell phones, biotech, genetic medicine. what are those new fiber optics? I mean, just a whole range of industries, which revolutionized the auto industry. Before Reagan, if you went to an auto shop, the guy would look under your hood for a while and get his hands all black and greasy and come out and say, well, what you need is this will be $345. And now, after Reagan, with everything electronic, they put it on a machine, they find out where the bad electronic parts are, and they pull out a little plastic thing, take the wrapping of it, plunk it in, and they say, that'll be $345. And their hands are still clean. I don't know if their hearts are still clean, but their hands are. And, we went from a mechanized age to an electronic age in that period. All of it because of this new influx of capital, which would turn around into the benefit of the common good. Reagan's idea was, how do you lift up the poor, not how do you beat down the rich? And if you look at the figures, that just happened for a 20-year period. And in addition, we defeated the Soviet Union because we frightened them to death that we could do that. From where we were so quickly to become so wealthy, they couldn't match that. And we were paying for our military with less than 6% of the national budget, and they were paying more than 20, and they couldn't keep up. Okay, I've gone on long enough, and I'd like to get some questions to make sure I cover ground you're interested in. Yes?
It seems a lot of people are saying that the current economic crisis is a fault of the market. For example, that free markets don't always work. Could you speak to that?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat it. Yeah, free markets don't always work, people say. And the present financial crisis is a result of the free market. I think the facts show that the current financial crisis, and it is a financial crisis, I mean, it's in the financial sector, not just in stocks. Stocks will suffer, I mean, companies will suffer because of the financial crisis, so indirectly it will affect other industries. But the heart of the matter is in the financial sector. And all three of our systems failed. The political system failed first. The economic system failed second. And third, we failed. We have a writing retreat in Delaware where we put up a house. After I won the Templeton Prize, I was able to get a mortgage and we could do it. And we put up a house where I could go to, when I was writing a book or something, and just be there for a month or two. And we paid a good amount, but modest. And since we've lived there, the property has doubled, tripled, quadrupled in value. Well, I mean, I was thinking to myself, this is crazy, this can't go on, but it kept going on. But what I should have said to myself is something is wrong. This just cannot be. And most of us who were enjoying these benefits, watching our capacity to take out equity loans go upwards as our houses became more valuable, we weren't complaining. We just thought we were lucky. Well, when you do that, you were lucky until you're unlucky. And what happened, the best analysis I have seen of this come from some of my economic colleagues at AEI. The federal government began to push for getting poor people into their own homes, get them out of the public housing, get them into their own homes. Now, I remember supporting that idea before it became a congressional idea, on the ground that homeowners are a different kind of animal than renters. They have a different investment in their community. And the way the community goes up or down affects their personal fortune so dramatically that they have to stay alert. But what I didn't count on is the Congress and specific people in it ordered Fannie Mae, which is the great mortgage agent, 3/4 government, 1/4 private. It's a government-supported institution, so its loans are guaranteed by the government. No other bank can make that claim in mortgages. And so they have an enormous advantage. They ended up financing most of the lower range of purchase of homes, up to about $400,000, let's say. And the government encouraged Fannie Mae to push for lowering the borrowing rate below the main rate. That's what they mean by subprime. Just to make sure people could meet the prime rate. And they didn't demand a down payment. Second thing they did. And third, they were refused to scrutinize the ability to pay. That would be invidious, discriminatory. Now, this is insane banking practice. I mean, to give people a piece of paper that allows them to take ownership of a property, which you don't know if they're going to destroy. They could go through and cut up all the woodwork and put it in the fireplace. They could do, you don't know what they're going to do. And you do this in the expectation they're going to pay you so much a month. It's a wonderful stream of income if you have it. So if financial institutions all over the world like to buy American mortgages because it was a guaranteed stream of income for them. Every month it would come the mortgage check. But these particular 5% of all loans had a very low probability of operating that way. Then, in addition, speculators got involved, not just poor people, but speculators made use of the same rules. People who make rules have to remember they're always going to have unintended consequences. People you're not thinking about are going to sneak into under the same rules. And if you have one set of rules, you got to let them have it. And people in Florida, for instance, were getting mortgages with no down payment. There came a time in Florida where 1/3 of all the houses bought and sold were for speculation. No homeowners living in them, just bought on spec. So you can imagine when that market collapsed, as it still is, it takes a while until you can use up the inventory and people start buying real new homes again. Well, the second step, so that was the government's fault. They created this illogical, self-destructive plan, and they refused to correct it. It was called to their attention by George Bush right from the very beginning. It was called to their attention by Republicans in Congress again and again and again, and it was protected so that it never. They did manage to get an audit, and they discovered all sorts of scam accounting abuses. They had to fire the head of it and the financial head, but then they went on as before. And anyway, the next step was in the economic system. I'm going on too long, but just allow me. In the economic systems, some of these bright kings of the world on Wall Street figured out some of these mortgages might be risky, but other ones aren't. Let's put them in a package. Let's sell packages of them and charge twice as much for a package. Because we've looked them over and gone to the effort of bundling them and doing the legal work to get them all together and so forth. And these that were picked up by hotcakes from people in Germany and China and everywhere else, all around the world. But now the danger is you didn't know which mortgages in your packet were good and which ones were bad. There was no way to tell. There was no transparency. And so suddenly the fear went into people, oh my God, we may own worthless paper here. Didn't know. And that's sometimes more scary than knowing. And then on top of that, other brilliant Wall Streeters, this I don't understand, but they built derivatives out of these things. I mean, that's just multiplying it all by 5 or 6, making it even less transparent, bringing in big profits themselves from selling these things. And they're all based on bright ideas. There are a lot more bright ideas in this world than there are good ideas, if you know what I mean. I once got thrown out of class in college because I was telling a friend of mine in the back of the room something which the professor insisted I tell to the whole class. I said, Chinese proverb, my son, there are in this world more horses' asses than there are horses. So I was humiliated by being made to march out of class, but actually I was feeling quite triumphant. I thought it was a great line. Anyway, so that, the economic system did really fail us, and the loss of transparency, and it was out of greed. And then I've explained how we should have known better. We should have insisted on the kind of regulation. This is one place where the Republicans were on the side of regulation. of this industry and of these two institutions in particular, and the Democrats blocked it. Now, in the last election, it's all been blamed on the Republican itch for deregulation. That couldn't be more wrong, couldn't be more false, but there we are. The other thing I want to point out is this, is that with markets, it is true that they fail. That's what markets are. But they're open experiments and they're transparent, and failure gets corrected. Some industry or some wing of it is not producing a good product or a product that's good enough, and somebody takes it, somebody steals everything out from under them. And it's meant to happen. It's a system based on what Schumpeter called creative destruction. I lived in Syracuse. That's where Bendix was made, and they made the ringers on the old washing machines. You put the clothes through. That was my job on Saturday mornings, is running the clothes through the ringer for my mother and then hanging them up outside. She put them in the washing machine, and the boys had to do the rest. And then these guys out in Iowa either opened up a new Bendix or invented the automated washing machines. And it was easier to build plants in a new place than to tear down the old plants and redo them. So that whole industry collapsed in Syracuse and grew up in Iowa, Ottumwa and other cities. One technology died, a new one came into being, and it's happening all the time. But the advantage of the market, since it's based on mind, is there are a lot of smart and eager people who are trying to figure out what the future is going to be and get there first. Nobody says it's a good system for the losers, but it's good overall that better products replace poorer products. The argument for the market is not that it's a perfect system. The argument for the market is it's a better system for the benefit of the poor than any other. And that's why the poor keep streaming here. This is practically the only place on earth where you can come in poor as a mouse and end up in 2 generations, even 1 generation, Andrew Carnegie 1 generation, being among the wealthiest people in the country. Usually by mind, by inventing something. Sorry to be so long, yeah.
To what extent would you describe the rise and fall of Enron as part of the natural cycle in capitalism? And most of our MBA students have read your Business as a Calling.
Oh, I'm pleased to hear that.
Where you had praised Enron's when it was written in 1996, and obviously something happened since then. I'd love to get your comments on it.
Well, even in what I wrote there, this is always called to my attention in business school. The students don't like it. What I wrote there was just a short paragraph. I was describing how different people had succeeded in business, and Mr. Lay had taken over Enron. A quite religious man, wanted to become a preacher, and then discovered his talent lay in business. That was his calling. And he really did terrific work, and he was the most generous man and ran the most generous company in Houston. Houston loved Mr. Lay and Enron. But he had some really smart financial advisors. Now, this is the way I piece together the story. I may not have it quite right, but I think I do. And they told him, look, we can make a new kind of business here. Think outside the box for a minute. And this is the line I have in that. They became famous for thinking outside the box. Instead of us dealing with the oil and gas, let us deal with the rights to do that. Let's become a financial company and sell these rights. And we'll lock up the oil and gas and have them ready at these prices. So they become the broker, as a way. And then these bright guys figured out if we do these financial transactions in the Caribbean islands, we'll get all kinds of benefits and multipliers. And it became so hard to follow on the books that the ordinary auditors back home weren't quite catching on to it was just too clever to what was going on, until one very religious evangelical Christian said she wasn't going to take this anymore. There was something wrong and smelly, and she was being rebuked and almost fired, and she just kept at it until an investigation. And by God, she was right. There was paper here that wasn't worth anything, and the values placed on it were false. So the whole thing unraveled. Well, one reason I haven't taken that out of the book, but I should add a footnote to explain this. The nature of that chapter is to say business is a moral enterprise in the sense that it can be immoral, too. I mean, everything business does is not just business, it's moral or immoral, or to some degree, one or the other. And you have to be aware that you're engaged in a moral enterprise here. And this is an example of one that went horribly wrong. It doesn't mean that everybody in the business was committed to the bad they were doing or even knew about it. But however good they were, it ended up doing evil. It not only destroyed the company and the savings and the pensions of its workers and the charities who had counted on its annual gifts or foundations that were built on ownership of its stocks. It destroyed the reputation of the whole industry. And not only that, it destroyed the image of capitalism all around the world. And that, in the end, was very punishing to the poor. Because the only way the poor are going to advance is if there are many, many small enterprises. Latin America have 100 million plus unemployed or underemployed people. And you look around and anywhere you go, and there's so much work to do. Just cleaning the streets, putting in electricity in favelas, which don't have it, putting in plumbing, building schools with lights, manufacturing refrigerators for every home. It's a tremendous amount of work to do. It doesn't make any sense. Work to do, unemployed workers. There's only one thing that can lift up those two wires and create a spark. That's an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur says, boy, we could do something here. Boy, I got the people to do it. And boy, I'll come in with the capital. And, whew. And they need 10 million new small businesses. They don't have to be big, but they probably will be small at first. Hire 10, 20, maybe 50. But lots of them. That's the way Italy does it. You know, in Italy, lots of new entrepreneurs started, after the Americans were there, started making paper plates and paper napkins, plastic forks. Now, a lot of Italians hated that. But by God, it's convenient. And so they've created all these little boutique industries for the humblest items of life that have been going like gangbusters. And that's what's changed the politics of Italy. Yeah.
This question is appropriate. I begin to have concern that the country that's built around the minds of the people and the creation here that's developed this picture that you talked about appears to be moving. One of them, the values that were there, are now merging with the values of other countries who have similar concerns. They have poor people, they want to include their situation. But by moving our jobs to other countries, it looks like we're also moving the creative thinking to other countries, and in turn impacting our own system, not only with outside values, but also with, where we were helping the poor, we're becoming the poor. We're becoming a nation of spenders rather than creators. As it affects market, as it affects capitalism, can it invert itself and actually come back when values are mixed, when talents are moved, to be able to actually hurt us in that way? How do you monitor it?
Well, you're quite right. There is a Peter's principle operating. If something bad can happen, it will. So markets do not promise us paradise, or capitalism does not promise it. It's hard to live up to all its demands and possibilities. So in principle, you're right. That could be happening. It's worth watching. In actual fact, I think the record is much better than, look, there's a big industry, especially in the newspaper world and in media world, in bad news. People love to read about bad news. You know, they love to read about bad things happening to other people. You know, it's human nature. And there's only one paper that in the whole United States that bucks that trend. It's the Euphoria Kansas Gazette. They never report unemployment. They just measure increased leisure time. And nobody reads the Euphoria Gazette, you know. So it's inherent in the news industry to be bad news people. But if you actually look at what happened, the argument you're making was first made in the 1970s. And they were called the American declinists. that we had overreached, and we were going to start to, Japan was going to replace us, the European community was going to replace us. We were going to be the third-rate economy. Then China would replace us. And look what happened. All the new industries in the world, or virtually all, were invented by Americans. I mean, American corporations just turned out to be very smart and very quick and very creative, and they began to see the importance of ideas in that generation of entrepreneurs, and they made companies more entrepreneurial than ever before. Not just like it used to be, if you had a steel company, my uncle would work for the steel company and know he had a good pension. That was going to be, everybody's always going to need steel. Little did he know that people were going to figure out how to make steel much better and much more cheaply in small plants than the one he was in. And the city would lose that mill and all the folks there. So nowadays you have to be more prepared for being in 3 or 4 different industries over a lifetime than before. You have to follow where the front line of progress goes. That demands quicker feet, quicker minds. And not everybody will do it. But just remind yourself of that little list I went through talking about the things that came about in America because of the Reagan Revolution. We have more people working in the communications industry, including cell phones and all that, new television, and you can't keep up with them, iPods. And I mean, I don't understand them. My grandchildren know them all, but when I need help, I go to my grandchildren. Americans weren't supposed to be that good. But by golly, we did. My father told me when I was young, Michael, never bet against the New York Yankees, Notre Dame, or the United States of America. And on the whole, he's been right now. Notre Dame's had some bad years, and the Yankees have had some bad years. And maybe the United States will have some bad years. But the United States has proved amazingly quick. What I think is really more worrisome is losing the symbols of virtue and value in our media and in our schools. I think the political system of the United States is better than it ever was. Thursday, you go to National Airport, the congressional section is filled with automobiles because everybody's gone back to their districts. And a lot more of the districts are competitive. Well, that's not quite true, but a lot of the districts are quite competitive. And even people who are safe better keep in touch. And I think they're more in touch with the people than they ever were. The bad thing that happened in the U.S. government was the invention of air conditioning. Washington was so miserable in the summer that we only had 6 months' worth of government, which was about right. Now that they can be there all year, it's got much worse. But they sit and dream up mischief. But they do stay close at home. The economic system, as I just said, we're producing more wealth. We've got more people employed than ever before. The number of employed Americans, I remember I'm not an economist, but I remember following at what was 98 million and thinking it might get about, and boy, it just shot up, 116 million, 130 million, 20 million new under, 18 million new under Reagan, 2 or 3 under first Bush, 20 million under Bill Clinton. Who knew that'd all be special prosecutors? But, you know. Clinton did a tremendous job in the job creation part. And Bush now, much as he's blamed, 10 million more people working today than when Bush took office. He gets no credit for that. But, you know, that's life. Like I told my children, God, you know, life isn't fair. Get used to it. But what I'm really worried about is the morals presented on television and in the movies. My stomach revolts at most of the movies. And what really depressing is, in the old days you used to be able to teach your children. Now we have a little shrine in the living room where you have somebody else teaching them all the things you don't want them taught. And the other people are more attractive. You know, it's really hard for parents to bring up their children in a healthy, good way. As before. But, you know, a surprising, astonishing number are doing it. I mean, astonishing number of young people are just so terrific. So they're letting it wash off like a duck. But there are a lot of victims of it. I think that's the section, the moral cultural system, which is most in due for reform. That's why I think what you're doing here at Colorado Christian university is so important. We've got to reclaim the universities one by one for the virtues and the aims and the purposes of our founding, which is such an extraordinary founding. I think it's one of the most important events in Christian history is the founding of the United States, with the possibility of developing a more Christian kind of nation than the world has ever seen before. Despite its appearances, people hate capitalism, so they think we're awful. They don't understand that's why people keep coming here. There's a line around, where you try to get into America, there's a line from the visa office. Goes about 100 miles long. 5 million people trying to get in at any one moment. And why? Because it's such a creative, inventive system, and they've got. And if you're poor, you get a chance. So we need to keep creating the places that keep faith with our founding, and you can lose it so quick. What have you wrought here? A woman asked Benjamin Franklin as they left the Constitutional Convention. Imagine locking up the Congress or delegates from the Congress for 53 days with no press, and then the people of the town, eager to get the gossip, threw a huge party for them after the last day they finished their business. And this lady sails across the floor like a battleship and comes up to old Ben Franklin and says, "So what have you wrought, Mr. Franklin?" And he looks up at her with his little glasses and said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Knowing that all republics in history had failed after 2 or 3 generations, and hoping that they had figured out a way to make one that wouldn't fail. At least had a chance not to fail. Thanks a lot.